And so what I'd like to do is just give everybody a 2-second refresher and then go through 3 of the easy recommendations from the board to consider, and then get into the actual difficult one at the end, so we can reserve as much time as we can to deal with that.
Things good.
All right. So let's get started.
I'm gonna mute myself.
Quick reminder. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. We're good. Okay. So a quick reminder here is this opening slide, just to help everybody remember what we did on issues of diversity. We initially funded that to try and capture data in those 5 areas at the bottom. And then note also that the weighting that we have applied here, because we're going to have to deal with that towards the end of the meeting as well. So just refer to that if you need it for reference. I can also pull it up as needed as well. But essentially, the board has asked this subcommittee, ultimately PEPSC, which this subcommittee is working on, 4 little suggestions to the model that was presented to them. One is to establish a floor to the minimum number of surveys required, so that we can make generalizable statements, so on and so forth. The second one is elevating the value of EdTPA and PPAT in the calculation of domain 1. If you look back in domain 1, we have 4 measures in there: NESIS, EVOS, proficiency, which we don't have a measure of yet, and EdTPA, PPAT. Right now, those are all given equal weight. What they're suggesting is, given that we've heard from folks that the most controllable variable in the EPP's arsenal is EdTPA, PPAT, should that be a much higher weighting as opposed to equal weighting of those other measures? So we're going to get to that in a little bit. The third one is extending the duration of the, extending the duration of the sanction period. And then the fourth is including diversity in the accountability now, as opposed to 2 years from now, when we have a full data array. And currently we can look at growth and diversity, currently we can look at race and ethnicity and gender right now, and we can collect some of those other measures over the next 2 years. But we could, if it's the will of the commission and this subcommittee, we could explore ways to leverage those now as opposed to later, and then we have to think about how to leverage those. So that's what we're going to try and accomplish today. Any questions about that before we move on? All right, and just since we're a small group, just jump in as needed. So the first, again, I want to go through these 3 easy ones because they'll go pretty quick. The first recommendation from the board back to PEPSC was to establish the floor to the minimum number of surveys required for use in the accountability model. The reason for that is the employer survey is currently, the response rate is about 50% when we look at 2017 to 2019. And the recent graduate survey, the median response rate is about 35%. So when we think about surveys, you know, getting anybody to take a survey is a Herculean effort. Those are decent, but when you try and incorporate that into an accountability model, then it starts to get a little bit suspect. So can we up that? And the quick answer is potentially. And one possible solution that I'm championing with this subcommittee is to think about modifying policy TCED 016 under the beginning teacher support program requirements to add this language. I'll give you a second to on that. But essentially, what we can do is we can up the ante of the surveys to be a part of, you know, actual requirements, and that would force the hands of LEAs to actually follow through on it. Like right now, Wake County, for example, doesn't want to play ball on the principal, the employer survey side, and feels like they don't have to. They are concerned for some reason that what we're doing is looking at individual teachers, and they have a problem with that, when in fact what we're trying to do is we're trying to assess the EPP, not the beginning teacher in this calculation. So we would have more teeth if we added something like this into the language of policy to make it have more rigor, and then that would in turn up the response rate in both of those surveys. Any thoughts about that as a possible strategy?
I really like it. This is Ann. Like, I think that when they do, yeah, that's all.
Okay, we got one yay. Anybody else thinking about that as a possible solution?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea too.
The other thing I like about it is that it gets higher numbers, which means more EPPs will actually have real data that they can think about for their own program improvement, which is really helpful. The accountability obviously is certainly one component of it, but being able to have meaningful data to drive decision making in addition to the accountability is very helpful.
Andrew, upon whom does the accountability for what's in red fall? If, for example, in the case that one of the two surveys isn't completed, do we just keep reminding the principal and the beginning teacher to complete them? What?
Well, so we could informally add a carrot or a stick to this as well, right? So if we it would fall on the LEAs to actually get their principals and their teachers to move on this. And so teachers, it would be a portion of completing their beginning teacher support program. If they didn't meet that, then they wouldn't be able to get out of the system. And for the principal side of things, if the principals decided they didn't want to play ball, or if the LEA decided they didn't want to play ball, then a recourse we would have is to say, well, then we can't allow student teachers to play ball in your district. So there are ways that we can go about bringing sticks to this if we wanted to, but I think just having this in policy will help up the ante considerably. I think we don't have to go down the stick route overtly at the moment.
So I also wanted to add that where this would be in the policy would be under their BTSP plan, so they would have to include it as part of their plan.
Okay.
Right. Yep. Okay, so let's assume that we're, anybody opposed to this, or can we move on for this? Hank, I haven't heard from you yet. Dr. Wedding.
Hi, Andrew. I'm great with it. Sounds good.
Okay, all right, good.
And Andrew Lockett is on too.
Oh, hey, Andrew, I didn't see you there.
Hey, no worries. Yeah, I'm good with it.
Okay, good. All right, so let's go to the second one, number 2. Consider elevating the value of EdTPA and PPAT in the calculation. I mentioned that in the beginning. So currently, NESIS, EVOS, and EdTPA, PPAT are equally weighted, and that domain represents 55% of the composite. The question for you all, as was voiced, and this is not, the board is not really coming back saying, if you don't put this in, we are not going to vote in favor of this. The only one that they were really strongly against, if we don't do something on this side, would be the diversity component. What they were saying was, if EPPs value EdTPA and PPAT really highly, that's the area they have the most control over, should they then champion the notion of giving that more weight in the grand equation of domain 1? And so that's the question to you all. What I did in the Excel file, and I'm trying to find my mouse. One of the Excel files I sent you was the accountability model. And I'm pulling that up, and I'm going to get that over on the screen here. In the accountability model, I don't know what this is. This may not be worth a lot to you because the numbers are so wonky to think about it, but under the domain 1 options tab, I basically cooked up, if we added NESIS at a quarter EBOS at a quarter, and EdTPA, PPAT at a half. That would be what the domain weighted average would be. I also made it more extreme at 10%, 10%, 80%. And then just so you could see what they would look like when they are essentially equal, I did 33, 33, 34, so that you can see how those things are moving about. And again, I'm relatively agnostic to it, but I think it's hard to get your head around it, because basically what you're doing is you're creating that, and then you're cooking that into 55% of the grand model. So it's hard to make that decision. But let's just talk for a second about, do we, the subcommittee, do you all feel like they should be equally weighted, or would you like to move towards a more dominant role for EdTPA and PPAT in Domain 1?
I totally agree with that, Andrew.
You are in favor of that. Okay. Well, and one of the things that Tom was mentioning is because there's very little variability in the other two measures, that moving this around isn't going to have that much effect anyway. But we can elevate the role. So, are anybody opposed to that, or think that that's a bad idea?
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is, so we have sometimes, like this semester, we had someone that had to, I still can't figure out how to turn on my camera, sorry. It won't work. I know there's a button, it won't work. Okay, so we had someone that put in condition codes. We had another person who had to redo a task. So my question is this on, by the end of the semester? So like, is this after the second?
So that's a great question, Ann. So essentially how this would play out is we view the EdTPA and PPAT assessments as one of any of those licensure testing requirements. So because of that, it falls under the attempt in the first, pass by the end of the third.
So are you saying there'd be two numbers or one number? Percentage?
I'm saying we would not calculate the percentage until the end of the third.
Okay. I think that makes it fair for EPPs. Because, you know, if somebody gets condition codes because they didn't put up the right file, then you're not,
Right.
Yeah.
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah, so we would not look at that until we would have a full scale of that.
Andrew, if given that there are 4 variables at play, would we do the same thing with the other 3? I mean, philosophically, I like the recommendation because it's the domain is EPP performance. How is the EPP doing in terms of preparing the person to be in a classroom? So EdTPA to me is the most clear correspondence with that. NESIS would be the second most clear. The other 2 are outcomes of their practice, not, I mean, I know this is splitting hairs. There's a difference between their practice and the effect of their practice, if that makes sense. So the ones that can be more directly tied to their practice would be the bulk of the weight in that domain, and the 2 that are outcomes of their practice would be less weighted less, if that makes sense.
Okay. It does make sense, and keep in mind we don't even have a proficiency variable yet, so
Right.
That's upon what's the word of the day, Ann? Practicable? Where
As practicable.
As practicable.
Not practicable at all. As practicable, so no.
So given that, I mean, you know, this group, if you are of the opinion that elevating its value is a direction we should go, then we have to decide on what that is going to be. So I can't. I mean, I've cooked a couple basic ones here. I can cook 1,000 of them if you want me to cook 1,000 of them. I'm just trying to get my head around how to proceed in an efficient way so that we can get that out to you all.
What was Tom's recommendation? I mean, I consider him like the stats guru.
Yeah, so essentially what he was saying is, even if you change this a lot, it's not going to have that much impact because the other variables don't have much variability in them.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So like, everybody's getting essentially a 90% to 98% on Nisus kind of thing. There's very few people that are getting a train wreck, right? So those are the kind of things that don't have much variability in it. So the real variability might lie in the EdTPA, PPAT anyway. And because it's in there anyway, it's likely gonna function the same way whether you do a lot of moving of it or not.
I do think it is a kind of a political statement that it is something we do control more than other things. So
would you
I don't know about the percentage.
Would you like to double it? Would you like it to be half the value of that measure and the other two at 25%? And we can tweak it when proficiency comes into play. And that's the other thing. We can change that as other measures come into play. Or do you want it to be really dominant?
Yeah. Hey, this is Andrew. I like increasing the EdTPA both because I feel like given that it's standardized and across the board, it feels like a good measure, and to raise, it's a direct correlation, ideally, to how good the preparation is. I get a little nervous elevating Nisus to the same, man, I hear your point, and I don't want to overweight outcomes, but I do think it's important that outcomes play some role here. And given that Nisus is at 90% and there's no variability, I don't know. There's something in my mind that's like, great, let's increase EdTPA considerably. But I actually think that the growth data, I would propose we have the growth data and that outcome, that effectiveness outcome a little bit higher than the Nisus.
I will counter that point, Andrew. I think I like the 50, 25, 25 for now, because we don't know what kind of impact this is actually going to have in terms of, and the Nisus data should be principal observation, so that we should take into account their supervisor, and that should correlate with growth. And if it's done correctly, in my opinion, there should be some correlation there. So I kind of like those two factors being the same. But anyone else, please speak up if you have other thoughts.
I'm happy with the 50, 25, 25. I think that makes good sense right now. I think moving to 80 on EdTPA, maybe that's something we look at in the future. But I could see for some of the really small institutions having a bad year and having one or two students tank could do you in potentially. Not that maybe it shouldn't. Okay. That's how small it is, but I like 50, 25, 25, I think.
Okay. We got 2 votes for that. Anybody else in favor or relatively agnostic? All right, for time's sake, let's just hold on to that for now. Let's go back to the PowerPoint, go to number 3. Thank you for that. So number 3, let's see here. Extend the duration of the sanctioning period. So remember I said I voiced some concerns that potentially we could get in a scenario where an EPP gets identified as having a sanction, and they could, lo and behold, get all the way to being revoked before they even have a shot at turning things around. And so generically, I think it was Dr. Marr had brought up the idea of maybe extending the sanctioning 1 year. And then as I started looking at the law, it gets quite more complicated than that. So what you're seeing here is 107 that's kind of outlined. When you have a warning, when you have probation, and when you have revocation. And in that, what I've put is an arrow to each of the conditions and how many years it would take for you to go from your current warned status to revocation. And so you'll see here, like if I look at under warning status under A, if an EPP fails to meet the performance standards set by state board for the overall performance on any of those indicators in any 1 year, if you start there, you would effectively have 4 years from the point at which you said go, you have your initial sanction, you would have 4 years before you would be revoked. And you can see how that's playing out because, after that you would go into probation, and then, you would have 3 years in probation in order to come out of that. So long story short, the one that is, the areas that are the smallest would be under probation Part B. You would only have 3 years to turn that around there. And obviously under revocation, you would only have 3 years to turn around there. So now I guess what we're saying back to the subcommittee is there are very specific conditions here associated with time duration. And so I'm asking you all again, are there specific things you would like to extend or generically extend, make everything to be further out? I guess a generic question would be, how much time should occur between the point at which you are sanctioned and the point at which you get revoked? And then we can adjust accordingly within that time frame. That making sense? Hard to explain.
Andrew, on section 3B,
Yep.
where it is 1 year,
Yep.
has been on probation status for 1 year and the state board determines that revoking the program's approval is reasonably necessary. What
Yes,
can
you'll see that under 1D. I'm sorry, under warned D, you'll see that under probation D, and you'll see that under revoked B. They reserve the right, and I think when they say they reserve the right, it would have to be something egregious, right? It's them basically saying, here are the conditions by which you should be sanctioned, and if something doesn't fit within these parameters but is completely egregious, the board always has the right to step in, intervene, and say, no, we're pulling the plug right now.
So if you were already on probation for whatever reason, and then you did something in addition to that, while you were on probation, the state board can, in essence, we're done with you.
They could go that route according to the way it's cooked in 107.
They could do that
And
even
I
if you weren't.
don't know what that is. I don't know what would trigger that. I mean, I think I have an obligation to say to the board every year, these are the institutions that are in good standing. These are the institutions that are warned under probation, so on and so forth. And obviously the follow-up question from somebody like JB or really anybody on the board might be, well, why were they sanctioned? And I could say A, B, C, D, and E, and they would say, okay, or they would say, wow, that's jeopardizing pipeline. We have to think more aggressively than that, so on and so forth. That's how I would think that would play out.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick, Andrew? I'm trying to follow all the lines here. So let's say I get down to the revoked, the 3A is assigned probation status for 3 consecutively. Does that mean at that time of receiving, what's the 3 mean there? Do I have 3 more years at that point to try to get myself out of revocation?
Yeah, right. So the point at which you are revoked, if you have 3 years of probation, you are revoked. That's what so revoked A is 3 years, and you are revoked at that point. And you would have to be in probation for 3 years consecutively. Does that make sense?
And you would have already had a year of warning prior to going on probation.
Yeah, in theory, you have gone from warned into probation, and if you're in probation only 1 year and you come out of it for 1 year and you go back into it, you're started over again. So it has to be 3 consecutive years in order to be revoked.
Gotcha.
So I think the ask of the subcommittee here is, do you think these particular numbers associated with this, I found myself going through the same exercise, right? Like, you know, when I'm thinking about probation fails to meet performance standards in any 3 race, gender, ethnicity, demographic groups in any 1 year, I mean, if you know, part of me is like, the 3 years is not that much time to turn around, but it's also saying that, you know, multiple areas are falling over 3 years in a row. And it's really longer than that because you would have to get from warned into probation. So, I can generically see where there could be concerns, but for you guys who manage EPPs for a living, do you feel comfortable being held to those criteria, or do you think you need more time given what you're seeing there?
Andrew, I have a question.
Sure.
Before somebody got revoked, or could they just drop the area? Say they were going to get revoked for, you know, middle school social studies. I'm just make something up. Could they just say we're just?
They could. Yes.
Yeah.
The answer to that is yes, but I want to put a caveat on that, Ann. In some instances, the program could be so small that it would be difficult for us to distinguish from one program to another. So that is not going to be hard for places like ECU, UNC, Charlotte, NC State, where they have massive amounts of numbers. But where we're only looking at aggregate at the whole institution's program, right? Like all of the little programs within it, it's not such an easy lift to do for the smaller programs. So it's kind of yes and kind of no.
Okay, thank you.
I will say historically, there were 2 or 3 programs prior to my becoming a member of the State Department, and they were getting to the point where their program was going to get sanctioned, and they chose to drop their program entirely as opposed to going through that public scrutiny. So that was a common course of action prior to all of this stuff and my couple years of being here at the State Department.
Andrew, I think I understand the rationale, but under warned B, you fail to meet in 2 areas, you have 5 years.
Right, and that's because you move from warned into probation and then have 3 years from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
but yes, and juxtapose that to C under warned. If you fail to meet in 1 area, you have 4 years. It seems to me you're almost better off to fail in 2 and get 5 years than fail in 1 and get 4. I'm not
right, and that's what I'm saying. Like doing all the gymnastics associated with this is a little bit weird, right? So
yeah, maybe 4 years to 5 years may not be a critical difference. But it does seem to sort of suggest if you have an issue with Section 1C, you're better off to have an issue with Section 1B because you give yourself more time.
Mm-hmm. So given that, should we think of a way to promote back to the lawmakers to make an adjustment for 1C? Is that what you're advocating, to try and get 5 years there?
Well, I don't know. I just wanted to make sure I was interpreting I don't know that there's a good fix. I just wanted to make sure I was interpreting what it means correctly.
I think another thing to look at too is the, not this chart, but just for us to think through is, we try, you know, what, as EPP, sometimes we make decisions based on one set of data, but our accreditation processes are usually three cycles of data. So we look at trends. I look at try to look at trends in 3 cycles of data. I don't know about other folks. Sometimes we make a decision based on something that happens immediately, but I'm not sure changes can be made quickly if people aren't seeing trends. And I'm wondering about these timelines with that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great, you're bringing up a great point. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's certainly worthy of discussion, yeah.
Oh,
Especially with small programs, right? Like if you're a big program and you see 2 cycles of data, you might be like, we got Houston, we have a problem. But if you're a small program, you're going to be like, well, that was, you know, person X. And that, you know, they, you know, and yeah. And so like so a trend needs to be a trend and not a person in a small piece. So I don't know. So thoughts on that? I think you were going to say something.
no, I was just going to say, I think I answered my own question because I didn't read the second half of 1C. So it's premised on 2 consecutive years. So you've already built in the first of the 5 years. Now you've got 4. Okay, yeah, it works. I got it.
Okay. Yes, I mean, the way I think about this is, if you are an EPP and you get one of these identifiers, do you think you guys that are deans that run programs, do you think you have ample time to turn it around before you get revoked? That's the question we're trying to answer. And if the answer is no, then we have to come up with an alternative. And that today is not the time for that. We should just let you guys marinate on that and come up with some ideas over time. If the answer is yes, I feel like as a dean, if I was running a program and I fell under a warn status of this, I think that would give me 2 cycles to do the turnaround. I think I should be allowed to do that. And I think if you gave me more time, I don't know, you know, I'm just creating bad outcomes in perpetuity, and I don't want to do that either. So that's the question. And do you guys feel comfortable with the timelines to be able to turn around a program that could be in jeopardy?
Andrew, in the context of the accountability components related to sex, race, and ethnicity, 5 years would be a sufficient amount of time given appropriate resources. In the absence of those resources, make it 25 years. You're not going to turn it around. I think we sort of hit that intersection where this is not a matter of can the EPP do it in 5 years. The EPPs would have already done it in the presence of commensurate resources. If the resources aren't there, the timeline is irrelevant. It'll never happen. So that's an unsatisfying response, I'm sure. But on sex, race, and ethnicity, this all falls apart if the resource structure doesn't change.
So I agree with that. I also think going back to the 3 cycles, so if 3 years I have trend data, and then I really have 1 year to turn it around before, that's pretty tight. I also go back to the statement that when we had our joint committee meeting, when they said that, you know, that the resources and this isn't meant to be a gotcha. I think about that too. I don't know. I'm not sure. I have to think about this more. I don't think I'm ready to cast my true opinion on this yet.
Andrew, can you walk me through? Maybe I'm feeling a little slower this morning, but let's go through an example. So I'm on 1B and I'm an institution who gets warned, right? Because I haven't met two of the sex, race, or ethnicity areas. And then we come to the following year. Do I go on probation the following year? Walk me through how it looks, how many years I have in each section. I think I'm getting myself confused looking at the numbers.
I think I'm getting let me see if I can actually do that for you. So in 1B, you fail to meet the performance standards in any 2 race, gender, ethnicity, so on and so forth. That would warrant that would warrant a warning status. And then at that point you would go, let's see here. Would you go to probation? That's overall performance standards. 3 performance standards. Oh, 3 consecutive years. I think you would go to. I can't remember. I did this a week ago, so now I'm starting over here. So bear with me. Oh, here it is. I think what would happen is you would meet 1B the first year. You would then fall under category 1C the following year because you failed to meet a 1 category 2 years in a row. And from there, you would move to 2C, probation C. And essentially that's how you get to 5 years because you have that extra year in 1B and then you fall under the same category as 1C. Is that making sense?
So you've got 1 year to get at least one of those categories up, or you go on probation.
Well, the first year you would have 3. So the first year you would fall under a warning status under 1B. Then the second, let's say nothing changed and you still had 2 areas of sex, race, or gender that you didn't meet. Then you would fall under 1C because now you have at least 1 that has happened 2 years in a row. Is that making sense?
It is. So I guess that's the question. So I get 1 year to try to make that one better, or I go on probation, and then I get the rest of my time on probation.
Andrew, I think you're on, the way it's written, you are on a warning status for 3 years. So you get put on warning, it kicks you down to 2C, and you have 3 years in that 3 consecutive years in that status, even if the variable changes. So let's say it was male, that one you resolve, but then you have a problem with ethnicity, you're still in that warning status. And that can last up to, it looks like to me the way it's written, it can last up to 3 years. And if you don't resolve it in those 3 years, then you're on probation.
I got to think about that. That's giving a lot more time than I had calculated. Consecutively measured years. The problem with 1B is that it doesn't have an easy progression to get into probation. That's one of the issues. So I was taking the route of assuming that you would be under warning for the first year, then you would go into, you'd still be under warning because you'd have 2 consecutive years under 1C, and then you'd have to get 3 consecutive years get it to become under probation, and then you would have 3 from there. So maybe it's 6. Is it 6 total? The fact that we have to use an abacus to figure out what we're doing is problematic in and of itself. Let's be clear about that.
You think? Yeah. So we each need to think about a scenario and come back with some questions around this one? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think we should this committee should investigate whether this is the most appropriate way to deal with sanctioning.
Yeah.
And if there is an alternative to that, we should propose that as an alternative. But keeping in mind anything that gets proposed can get thrown out the window by either the board or the JLEOC, right?
So, Andrew. Yeah. I think I don't know whether I'm happy about this or I'm afraid of this. The logic of it makes sense to me. Okay. But I'm starting to think now maybe I shouldn't feel that way. But I think what we need is a decision tree for each of the items under 1. So we would have 4 decision trees, and it would be, so we take scenario A, and there sort of then follows that if then. I mean, the closest thing in the academic world we have is the promotion and tenure decision tree. If X is the case, if there's a yes, here's what happens. If there's a no, here's what happens. And what that does is then plays out the chronology of the number of years, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes total sense. Kim and I can put that together. How about we get that to you in the next 24 hours? We can definitely do that.
Well,
and that's part of the problem is there's so many scenarios. It's just hard to get your head around what the if-thens are.
I give you 48, because I think you're ambitious on a Monday morning, Andrew. Good job.
But probation and revoked really sit on Warren. You can't jump directly to probation or revoked unless the state board finds something. It's like the NCAA death penalty. If something's so bad, we've got to shut your program down.
But is that true? Because 2B would put you right on probation.
Yes, 2B is just, I was just going to say that 2B is one standalone that if wheels are falling off all over the place, you would fall into probation out of the gate and skip Warren.
And that's another diversity one, which is our toughest one to control.
Well, and the other issue there is, it disproportionately affects the larger institutions right now because they would have more measures disaggregated down to those individual race, gender, and ethnicity. So the bigger programs could be subject to greater risk if they don't satisfy subpopulations. I understand the intent of the law, but the way it's set up right now is not exactly fair for across all EPPs. Everybody understand that?
Are we on a timeline for resolving it?
I think we have to come up with something in not tomorrow, but we can't just punt this another 6 months. I think we have to come up with our best effort sooner rather than later.
Right.
Knowing all the time that the default is what's currently in law. So why don't I, just for time's sake, why don't I work on a decision tree for that and get that out to you all? Because what I'd really like to unpack here in our remaining time, Kim, how much time do we have? Are we till 11 or are we further out?
We have 40 minutes. 40 minutes.
Okay. For time's sake, I would really like to get to this diversity conversation, if you guys are all right with that. or would you like to sit with this another couple minutes and tinker?
I'm fine with moving forward.
Okay. All right, so let's unpack this diversity topic here. So let me lay the groundwork on that. So you recall that this is one that there were 3 board members at least. There are probably more, but at least 3 board members felt very strongly that they would like to see diversity included sooner rather than later. We have data. If you recall, the reason we were punting was not because we didn't want to do it, but because we didn't have a full array of data out of the gate. And I think their argument is, let's just use the data that we have to get started. And as we add other measures into that, we can do that later on. But they would like to see diversity included in some capacity. So what they said specifically was, can we explore ways to consider growth and diversity relative to the general population of each college or university? So they felt strongly about, can we somehow come up with a way that Elon University's demographics and diversity of their institution, which is unique to their particular scenario, can we make that a part of the calculation? And so to that end, and you guys, some of you were on this conversation, some of you, this may be new. We created, Tom and I spent 2 weeks banging our head against a wall, and we came up with the race gender by institution version 9, which you all have access to, and it's going to be much easier to navigate on your own rather than me trying to do it, although I'm happy to try. But essentially what we did was we calculated just that. We took individual demographics into consideration, and we came up with essentially a 10-year model. What we basically said, and this is towards the bottom here, was, we developed this calculation based on number of people that you have, that you would have to move the needle a certain number of people each year over the course of the next 10 years to have your program match the demographics of your broader institution, and that would be the goal going forward. I think the only thing I heard from, I think it was Mr. Ford, was he felt like 10 years might have been a little long, maybe we should make that smaller. But the point is, we have a way of doing that, and then there's a lot of weeds that this group has to come up with to navigate if-then statements. What do we do about non-degree seeking EPPs, because they don't have an institution that they're pulling from? They have a general population to pull from. So there are all these conditions. How do we handle folks that don't have any need to move much over the course of 1 year to the next? Should they be striving for other things? So I don't have an easy way to navigate this. I guess the first question is, this is really a generic question, is, do you EPPs that are on the call, do you like the idea of having a diversity component that is conditioned to your individual institution demographics? Do you like that approach?
I like it as one of, as a choice. I'm thinking about UNC Charlotte, who probably has a percentage that's greater than the national average of folks who are diverse, but it looks like they're going to have to grow eight people a year over the next 10 years to get to where they need. And if it's shorter than that, it could be up to 16 a year, which if they had the other option to meet a baseline of, we're going to say 18% for the state of North Carolina, or whatever the number ends up being, if you meet that, then this comparison really doesn't make a lot of sense, or it's not used in any kind of sanctioning. I think we had talked about maybe 3 different ways to look at this potentially.
That's right, we
It's
had.
just one.
We had, so let's review that real quick. So one way was, effectively you could meet diversity one of three different ways. You could either meet or exceed a state average. So we arbitrarily set a state expectation of non-white candidates or non-female candidates or non-Pell candidates, so on and so forth. Or I guess it would be Pell candidates. So we would set a state expectation, and then you either meet or exceed that. And if you meet or exceed that, you're good to go on that. You've met that criteria. If you don't meet that, then you can meet it a second way, which would be to meet or exceed your institution's demographics, which is essentially what we've laid out here. And that would be a yes or no. If you met that, you're good to go. If you don't meet it, there's a third criteria. And the third criteria would be that you would meet some expectation of growth over time. So that you would say, well, I'll give you an example. If we say percent non-white to be 22%, which is what Tennessee has, and my institution is at 5%, and my institution demographics are 17% of non-white. And I moved from 5% to 9%. I did not meet the state recommendations, and I did not meet my institution's diversity, but I am moving in the right direction, and because I'm moving in the right direction, I met the criteria, and we move on from there. So those were the three ways that we were looking at this. Now, what those criteria are, that's at the discretion of this subcommittee and ultimately all the stakeholders. So at what point are you growing sufficiently? If I added one non-white candidate, is that sufficient? Well, that may be a heavy lift for an institution that only has 2 candidates. That may be not sufficient for a UNC Charlotte that has 1,000 candidates, right? So those are all, if you wanted to go down that route, Dr. Weddington, then that is a viable route, but we'd have to think about each of those individual characteristics.
Andrew, I know we went to COVID-19 pretty, I don't know if we had that other meeting during this time or not. I can't remember when that meeting was, but one of the questions that I asked Tom and you and Kim was about, so I'll use Elon. So Elon, the School of Education is 5% of the entire population. The School of Comm is 30%. The School of Business is 30%. College of Arts and Sciences, the rest. So statistically, meeting the diversity of our campus being a much smaller percentage of our campus, I wanted to know if there was any kind of statistical impact on that, right? So also like choice of major, right? So I think it's just a whole. So do we have any response to that yet?
We have not gotten to that yet. I understand what you're saying. You're saying it because there are other variables at play, right? Which is,
Right.
If a minority student comes to Elon and and he or she has the choice of going down engineering versus politics versus mathematics versus education, that you're effectively competing with other programs within your institution to get that minority candidate to be an educator. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, right. And if somebody changes your major at Elon to education, and I'll just use Elon as an example, there is a 98% chance they're not going to be a comm or business major, right? Like if they come to Elon to do comm, they come to Elon to do comm. They come to Elon to do business, they come to Elon to do business. So we may pull somebody from the College of Arts and Sciences. So I was wondering about subgroups of diversity on your campus based on unit.
Explain that last part.
Like, can I compare to a comparable unit, right? So the College of Arts and Sciences is a comparable. I have no idea what their diversity looks like off the top of my head, and I don't even know if we calculate it like that at Elon. But I'm not going to pull, like, it's just a biased. It's a different type of bias, right? Because I'm a smaller unit. I'm using me as an example. I'm a smaller unit. I'm competing with units that are gonna draw a more diverse population because of the appeal of the majors that they have. So that increases the overall diversity of the institution. And how are we accounting for the bias and the other factors? I'm not saying it very clearly. I've got to get my stats talk down here.
Well, I think without getting in the weeds there, one way of accounting for potential bias in that area is to allow for multiple routes, right?
Yeah.
Which is what Dr. Weddington was saying, which is what Tennessee has done, which is the idea of, if we set this expectation for everybody, that may not be a route that is an easy route for you, and it may be easier potentially for another one. But the idea is that you would have 3 routes in order to meet or exceed the expectation that's in there, which is to try and move the needle in a meaningful way and elevate diverse candidacy into the pipeline. So when I hear what you're saying about, without getting into the weeds, I don't know the amount of duration it would take our shop to collect all the different institutions,
Right.
the diversity of all the different programs within the institutions, and then come up with a calculation is nothing short of astounding to me. So I am reluctant. I mean, I'm happy to explore it with Tom to think about it, but what we have in front of you is our best thinking to date. And it's not without some problems, but it is trying to account for the fact that your general demographics of your institution are radically different from other folks, and
Right.
trying to account for that into the broader conversation, and not considering what you're saying, which is within the institution itself. That would be a very hard lift for us to calculate.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the options. I'll also remind you, and what you already know, is someone could be sanctioned for it. So we have to check, so we have to make sure that it has as least bias as possible in it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And nationally, have we looked at national trends as well? As another option?
We can pull an array of national trends.
It'd be interesting to see if our state kind of matches national trends in terms of diversity, then it's kind of the same, right? If not, might be another factor, just to complicate the matters. Now I'm not going to talk anymore for this moment.
Wait, can I
Other thoughts?
Andrew, Ann, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit longer. Of all the things that we know, if we had to do one thing, what do you think is the fairest?
You mean of the 3?
Well, I sort of meant in a broader universe, but even of the 3, which is the fairest?
Is that for me or Dr. Bullock? I don't want to.
It was a question for Ann, because I the few minutes she spoke before that pause, I thought she really captured the tension in this, and within that, what would be the most
For you,
fair?
Andrew, I'm not bailing you out. Thank you, Van.
Well, I was asking Ann.
Hey, Andrew, you could plead the 5th and come back to us with that answer.
Well,
I mean,
hey, Andrew, I have a quick question.
Sure.
So, how does this apply to like non-traditional EPPs?
Well, that's
So
the problem.
Right, because we're doing.
This group would have to figure out a measure by which to hold all non-institution, in other words, they don't have a population, right? They're not a subset. They are the population. So we'd have to come up with a strategy for them.
Yep.
No question.
And if you had 3 different potential routes, they would just lose one of those potential routes, right? They'd have to do it one of the other 2 ways since they don't have an institution to
Or
compare
we
to.
or we could arbitrarily set their population as the state population, or something, something
Right.
like that. We could look at the calculation of all the institution EPPs, and we could create that as a population. And then they would function within that. There are ways we could go about that, but what Dr. Marr is saying is exactly right. We do not have a measure for them right now.
Yeah.
And did we ever settle on any kind of percentage over time growth measure for like that option 3, where we're not looking at the state threshold or the institutional comparison, but just how much you would have to grow to show that you're making a good faith attempt to stay out of probation status?
We did not. But the idea of growth, we'd have to think about what that would be. Would that be one, is it a percentage? Is it a number of people? So this group we'd have to determine what that threshold would be. I get leery. I mean, I can just tell you, just having thought it through when we were working on this a couple months ago, I get leery of the idea of, a UNC Charlotte moving the needle one person is a lot easier lift than, St. Aug or St. Andrews that only has 2 or 3 people and can only pull, a couple of people. So the lift gets heavier the smaller you are, if you're not careful about that. So we need to be sensitive to that.
So Andrew, since you don't have an answer about the fairest one, I would like for us to look at the national trends just to see as another option. I would like to suggest that.
Sure. Yep,
And I know that y'all's job is to do what we set out, but I think that you and Tom have been in the weeds on this. So I would like to hear Tom's opinion about what he thinks is the fairest. And then also, what about the non-traditional EPPs? And because I don't think we need to move this forward until we have that figured out. So what's some suggestions around that?
I like to propose
Being the facilitator of this group.
I like to propose one other, and I don't know if this, I think the comparison with the institution might capture some of this, but maybe not all of it. If we were going to set a statewide threshold, whether it's 22% or whatever it happens to be, I wonder if there could also be a regional threshold. Like, what students can we actually draw from to see if we're actually, in the Western North Carolina, those folks that are drawing from high schools that are predominantly white are going to have a harder time being diverse. So we'll see it maybe in other ways, but that could be one more measure to say we're making our institution more diverse or growing it more diverse in comparison to the region in which we live and pull students, the majority of our students, from.
Okay. Yeah, we can. So are you proposing, which region would you like to use on that? Would you want to do the 8 regions? Or would you want to do the 3 regions? Like, there's different regions. Do you have any suggestions on that?
I don't. I guess whatever
Right,
would make it fairest for folks.
I'll tinker with that a little bit.
Andrew.
I put this in the, oh, hey. Go ahead, Dan.
No, I'm sorry I interrupted.
I was just going to suggest, one of my worries here is that we could potentially inadvertently overcomplicate this thing. My takeaway from that time with the board members a couple weeks ago was that as long as we move to something, particularly around the places we have data now, they're going to be okay. They weren't saying that the 3 routes we'd offered were wrong or that they had any problems with that. And I think to Ann's point, about the institution might be tricky in some places. I just wonder if we set like a baseline percentage growth indicator 3%, 2%, I don't know what it is. But I mean, the whole point of this accountability model is to incentivize focus, right? Like, you don't have to be there overnight. We're not trying to sanction you. We want to see growth in a positive direction, or we want to see you outperforming your institution, or we want to see you meeting a threshold, which, by the way, I think the state board should have some say in setting, because they did say they want to put more resources to this, and that this isn't just an EPP challenge. So similar to the 22% in Tennessee, maybe the state board comes back and says, well, as a state, we're at 18% right now. Within the next 10 years, we want to be past 23 or 22 or whatever it is. We can offer that, but they need to name and claim that, I think. But part of what I'd recommend is, okay, we're going to do it now, not later, but particularly around race and gender. We're going to give you these 3 routes because we know there's going to be, to Hank's point, differentiation. I mean, if you're in Western North Carolina, your percentage of growth is going to, the percentage is going to be the same, but the number of candidates you need is going to be radically different than if you're in Eastern North Carolina. And that's okay, because I think the percentage helps build some of that equity into the process, in my opinion.
Okay. Dr. Dempsey, did you want to jump in?
I felt the urge to wanted to might be too much. What is the current year in which this becomes live?
It doesn't become live until it becomes law. Right now, what is in law is currently chugging, and the first point of sanctions can be administered, I think it's 21-22.
Okay.
And you can only start with a warning status there, and then it trickles out from there. So it's like another 2 years before you get to revocation, that kind of thing. So what we're tinkering with here is to say back to the lawmakers, we see what you're doing, and we have problems with it because of this, and this, and these are our possible solutions to that, and here's why, right? So that's what we're trying to build here.
So is it possible, well, let me give a sidebar point. The UNC deans met last week, and the Board of Governors has put out a statement that the UNC colleges, schools and colleges of ed, their EPP programs will diversify their student population. So, there are these, and the governor has put together the DRIVE task force. There are these things that are going to either come together or collide in a strange way. Is it possible to, I think what we're going to learn over a 2 or 3 year period is what the barriers are to being successful on this domain. We might see some innovative strategies in 2 to 3 years where some institutions got better, but I think this is if the state board wants this included in the model, and then we're going to hold EPPs accountable in that model for something that right now, basic knowledge of the profession, all the evidence we have tells us the EPPs are not going to be able to be successful. We could at least in a 3 year period learn what the barriers are. Now, I think this group in 10 minutes could list what the barriers are. The three options to me probably are the best way to find out what the state's going to actually have to do to be successful. This isn't about the EPPs. This is about the state. But we've been asked by the board to implement a domain, and if we can't change the sanctioning language, can we change the timeline? 2023 is when it becomes effective.
Yeah, you mean in terms of implementing sanctions? Yeah, that can certainly be that could be a recommendation. I mean, all these are recommendations. Everything we're talking about is doable or arguable.
Right. I just think if we went out and surveyed the institutions across all 50 whatever EPPs, and asked, given the current state of affairs, can you be successful with any of the three pathways? I would guess 50 out of the 53 would say no, for credible, data-driven reasons. We know why. I appreciate this, and we're talking about the state board. We're not talking about the Raleigh Rotary Club. The state board has said we want this built in the model. Surely they acknowledge the complexity and the difficulty of the EVPs changing the dynamics around this domain. I think to Ann's comments earlier, it's more explicit for the private institutions than the state institutions, but we're all going to face the same nearly inevitable conclusion.
I mean, yeah, I appreciate that, Van, because I think all roads are leading in this direction, whether we want to get it out in front of it or not. And honestly, the way I see it is right now we have the chance to shape how it's going to go. And I really do. Maybe I'm naive, and you all run large traditional EPPs, so it's a different story than Teach for America. But I'm pretty optimistic that if we have these three routes, a significant number of EPPs would be able to meet at least the basic threshold. I mean, for the ones we talked about where there's only 10 candidates, if we set the growth indicator annually at 2% or 3%, talking about going and actively recruiting either from your institution or senior in high school, one member. And if you're a UNC Charlotte that we've talked about where you're so large already that the growth indicator would require 16 people, they're actually already above the 22% threshold. So it just, I mean, I agree with you. We should look at like how folks might get there, and it might be worth asking people. But I actually think this feels like more of a boogeyman than it is when you break down the numbers. That's my opinion.
Hey, Andrew, Lakis, I agree with what you just said. And as an individual dean over with a UNC system College of Ed, could we affect some change that might get us from 14 African-American males to 16 African-American males, maybe even if we're ambitious, 17? Yes. And then we generalize that across the entire UNC system and the private and the for-profit and not-for-profit providers? Yes. All of that in the aggregate is going to be nearly meaningless in the magnitude of the problem. And so as a person involved in the creation and implementation of policy, what we're being asked to do with this accountability model is not going to change the macro system in that dynamic. And maybe I just need to get over it, and we just come up with the best model we can. But I go back to this is an interaction between a General Assembly mandated entity and the state board, and we are talking about the crumbs of a problem.
I don't disagree with you on that, and that was why when we had them on the call a few weeks ago, shared with them, and they seem to be game for this, but maybe we need to push on this a little bit harder. I mean, I think unless the state board sets this as like a key, goal with a number and then figures out all the different system levers it needs to pull on, then, we're only going to be able to do a small part. But it does just feel like this is our part to do, and that broader push and initiative is going to be equally as important.
Yeah. Well, in given all that, the only real variable we control is time. Let's stretch that timeline out as long as possible so we can learn what we need to learn about the whole model, but in this area in particular. I mean, it's back to Ann's point is, what are the ramifications of the accountability, the sanctionable parts of this? That's where this thing hits, in my opinion, hits the barrier.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that is a part of it. I mean, the other thing I know, if we play this out, let's say, and I know I've done this before, but if we say if the commission says back to the board, we stand by what we have, the board then will have to come up with its own model, which will hand it back to Tom and Andrew and Kim, and you're looking at the best thinking we can come up with. I mean, if you gave me another 6 months to look at this, I don't know how much more I can come up with in terms of variability and different path routes and all that. I mean, and to Ann's point, I think you're right, Ann. There are some problems associated with how we're looking at it, and so I think the idea of having multiple routes is helpful. And then maybe the alternative is for this group to think very carefully about how to deal with sanctions, because if you're running into, if the board is going to say we have to have diversity into the system, then it may mean that we have to reinvent how we think about sanctions on the other end, so that we don't unnecessarily kill the pipeline in ways that are unintended. Yeah. So those are the two that, that's, now we're back to the beginning of the conversation with the two subcommittees, right? That's why we were looking at those as two different sides of things, right?
Well, I think on that point, two things I just named. One is, and maybe I'm gonna check for understanding here, because maybe I misinterpreted this from our call in March, before we met with the state board. But I walked away from that call with the understanding that if we sent the next thing we send back is kind of our last hurrah. If the state board doesn't like it, we get cut out of the equation. And so I just think we need to keep that in mind, that this is kind of our last best effort. And then somebody else is going to be making the decision for us. And then two, this came up on that call a few weeks ago, but the thing I think we all need to be really worried about and have a concerted effort on, both in the legislature and with the state board, is that if they don't aggregate all of these domains, all of this isn't going to matter, because the standalone domain sanctions is going to spell doom for pretty much everyone. And unless we can get something out quickly and start lobbying to get that through the legislature and make that law change, I mean, it's just gonna spell bad things for the pipeline across the board.
Yep, noted and agreed.
Yeah, and Andrew Seiberg, to one of your earlier points, I think we have worked this to the best outcome we can get this to. And none of it, or many parts of it, are not, we simply are not going to get it perfect. We're going to get the best thing we can get. But I'm mighty mindful of Ann's points that even the best we can get it to has unintended consequences.
So I think then, okay, so I'm formulating a plan here. So one is, Kim and Tom and I can go back and get some of these additional data for this group. I still think it is an important voice from the commission to say, look, we did what the board asked us to do, and we tried to accommodate. And in this accommodation, this is our plan, right? So we'll set, that means this group has to set the percentage for growth. We look at the population. We deal with that. We deal with the 3 routes as best we can. And then we also give them, recommendations for the sanctions side of things, and a list of the concerns that are faced with heading down this path. Because I don't think they are obviously not aware of the level of granularity that you all are, of the complexity of the lift. So I think making sure that what we hand back to them is not just an accountability model, but the hazards associated with it and the concerns associated with it, so that they can have a full perspective of what's going on. And I'll be happy to champion that, to be at a board meeting and say, look, we're going to take 20 minutes here, and I'm going to walk you through what they did, and then I'm going to walk you through why they think some of this is squishy and where they have concerns, and lay all of that out. I think that's, to me, that I've never had a meeting with all of you that we come to consensus that we felt good about 100% good about these strategies. So my best solution would be to come up with multiple routes, which I think you're leaning towards, and to set those expectations as best we can, so that we don't kill the pipeline and voice our concerns. To me, that's where we have to head.
Well, again, the only thing I'd push us on, based on what James and JB said in the meeting, is that I think the only thing on this domain, the only thing they were really pushing back on was, at least on the things we have data for, we want you to start now. You bring us something that starts now and we'll approve it. So I would say, there's three main points we want to build into this and we want to get to that. One is we got to aggregate all the domains. Like that's a non-starter. If we don't aggregate the domain, we don't stand behind any of this, because it's terrible policy and it's going to have horrible negative effects. Two, for race and gender, we start in 21-22 with a 3-route model that's responsive and allows for growth over time so that we don't put anybody out to dry. And based on number one, it's going to be aggregated, so nobody would receive sanctions just because they struggled with this one domain. It would be built in at a much smaller percentage than the other stuff we've already talked about. We then say we want to explore over the next 5 years these other three, right, that are harder to capture. So Pell, non-Pell, rural, so on and so forth. And then on the third one, we share what we've decided on, where, hey, we heard you about the EdTPA, we made it 50%, we split the other two 25-25, and we show them that, we roll it out, we see if they approve it, and then we get to a whole nother animal, which is the the General Assembly actually saying, great, let's include this and let's go with it. And that we haven't even started to tackle that.
Yeah.
Based on the early feelers we got from some conversations I had, at least, the authors of these laws actually don't really love the aggregate sanctions model. So that's going to be a whole nother animal.
Yep.
Maybe name that for us, because I think that's where our time and energy is going to be best spent, is helping the General Assembly understand why a single domain sanction model is really problematic. I see so. And to your question earlier, Van, if we don't get something through in the next couple months, we're going to start 21-22 with those sanctions in play. For the single domain areas.
Yep. All right. So as we wrap this up, let's review. So we feel pretty good about 2 of the 4. We'll bring to the broader. When it comes time to doing the whole model proposal, we will add the policy change back into the equation, because everybody seemed to be okay with that. I'm going back to my PowerPoint here so that we can see that. All right, bear with me here. There we go. So this thing. So adding a change to TCED to up the percentage of people responding. It sounds like to adjust the EdTPA PPAT was a go. For this side, I'll go ahead and build some decision trees around this. There may be 1,000 of them, given all the different routes we can take, but I think that will help make an informed decision on that. And I will go ahead and start crunching building models based off of our original strategy. If I go back up to the original slide here, if we create a diversity domain 4 to include percent male and percent diversity, percent people of color, into a calculation, and we can do the 3 routes and run a couple scenarios to see what that would look like. To think about both the weighting within and the weighting across, right? So within diversity, do we want to do percent people of color? Are you guys opposed to just looking at percent people of color out of the gate and just do one variable for that until we get the other data? I mean, we have percent male too. What are your thoughts on that?
I get the sense the board cares about the racial background more than gender.
They absolutely care about that. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Andrew, I think it's more true, little t true, to what the state's challenge is around people of color. I think it is the central dynamic.
Agreed.
Okay. Well, let me just build a basic model based off of that, and we'll do the Tennessee waltz, which is what I used to do down at Florida State. On Tennessee Avenue was where all the college bars were. We do the Tennessee waltz. So we'll do the 3 routes, and I'll come up with a couple different scenarios of the 3 routes so that we can see how that all plays out. And then I'll apply a couple of different weights, keeping domain 1 as the lion's share as we have in the past. And let me just build a couple models. We'll see what we have.
Hey, Andrew Cyberg, I don't know if we're about to sign off, but may I make a statement to the other members, to the other commissioners?
You mean the broader commission?
You mean
or
next
the
Thursday?
No, I mean to the people on the call right now. This is not directed at you. It is to the commissioners. I certainly understand and respect that we are different from the state board in our policy recommendation and influence role, but we're not nothing. And obviously we've noted it in this call. We talk to members of the General Assembly too. We are appointed by the House and the Senate, and who else appoints us? Who does the at-large members?
Superintendent.
I think it's all done within the House and Senate.
Mm-hmm. That's all House and Senate. And we can't hear you.
Dr. Dempsey, we can't hear you yet.
We can't hear you.
In real terms, okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's
Yes.
better.
Yeah, I appreciate and respect the role of the state board and our relationship with the state board, but I also think we have to be agents of our own voice in articulating what's important. And I totally respect balancing what we're doing with the board, but we are not subservient to them.
That is a true statement.
I'm appointed by the Speaker of the House.
Yep. All right, so given that, I'll also, we'll take a look at the national numbers for ed prep programs. And I know that's something that you wanted. We'll make sure we get that. We'll also take a look at regional thresholds. That was something that I heard from, I think it was Dr. Weddington, see what that looks like as well. See if that can be incorporated in there. And we'll go back to the drawing board, see if we can build something for you. Any other business for the moment?
Thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for continuing scenario number 1,768, so we can try to come to a decision.
Hey man, it's difficult, man. There's a reason that we can't
It's
just look at another state somewhere and grab it, because it's tough. This is tough stuff.
And as a reminder, and Andrew, you can say this back, Andrew Lakis, you can say this back to your state board colleagues, Tennessee does not sanction for this as of now, correct?
I'd have to look, it's been another year, but, when we initially were pulling it up, looking at it, that was the case.
Didn't.
Correct. They knew it would take a while to get there. Because they didn't want to sanction somebody for something they didn't understand if it would move the needle or not.
Yeah, and well, and I think we should reiterate that. I mean, because I also think that's where we should point out that Tennessee rolls them all together and you don't get sanctioned for one stream or another. You get an aggregate score. And the more they can hear that and the more we can get that into action, the better.
All right. Good. We're on the same page. Good.
All right, are we out of time, Kim? We good?
We're 6 minutes over.
Well, I owe you guys 6 minutes. There you have it.
Stay safe.
Thank you,
yeah.
everyone, for
Thank you all.
attending.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, holler as needed.
Turn on your camera so I can see you all.
There you go.
It was nice
All right.
seeing everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.